All right. Well, thank you again for being with us. I was out and about running some chores yesterday, and it was kind of a delight to pass the neighborhoods where the children were very actively engaged in running about with their baskets and finding Easters. And it just kind of brings back all sorts of memories of the Easter experience that I had as a child and that we see children having. And we want to talk about a little today about what is the Easter experience? What is the experience uh, at the physical level, at the intellectual level, at the spiritual level, the three levels of consciousness. Now, I talk about the three levels because they really kind of help things fit together for me. And I discovered them probably almost 20 years ago, inadvertently, when I was doing some work in change management in corporate America. And I recently opened a book by Emma Curtis Hopkins that I've had on my shelf for a long time, and have browsed through it on a number of occasions. And I went back and I started reading it in earnest. And sure enough, there she has the three levels. She calls them the material, the mental, and the metaphysical. Now, this book was written, maybe 50 years before I was born, maybe 30, somewhere between 30 and 50 years before I was born. So this idea is not a new idea, and this idea is not original to me. It's been around in consciousness for a long time. And when we come to major holidays such as the Easter holiday, in a major holiday in many cultures, but not just a Christian tradition, but a holiday in many cultures, we can look at it also in several ways. We can look at it in the way of saying, well, what do people do? What is the material nature of it? What do? They dye eggs and eat chocolate bunnies and things like that. We can look at it intellectually and say, well, what does it mean? Why do all these different cultures have some type of a feast day or a celebration day or a holiday at this time of the year? What is the deeper meaning and the deeper significance of that? But what it ultimately comes down to is, what is the metaphysical experience? What is the spiritual experience that we have? What is this holiday a symbol of? What is it telling us about the experience that we can have at the level of our soul? That which we call the divine, that which we call God, is beyond the material, or before is perhaps a better way of stating it. It is before the material. Before the material exists, God is. Before the material exists in the form as we see it, God is. The invisible becoming visible, the word becoming manifest, these different ways of saying it. So if we wish to discover more of God, we can certainly use nature as kind of a gateway, but we must eventually get back beyond it. What is before nature? What is this compelling force that existed before nature, that caused nature to come into existence? What is that? If we consider the human consciousness, the human mind, and it's a very dangerous word because we all think we know what it means, and I don't think there's any agreement on what mind is, what consciousness is. But for today, we'll just talk about the intellectual consciousness, logic and reason. Before logic and reason existed, God was. So it is not mind creating God as it is God creating mind and expressing itself through mind. But nevertheless, before the human being, before human consciousness could think, could use logic and reason, God was. And God is. And if we wish to experience God, we must move to that place before thinking starts. So in the Buddhist traditions, they tell us we might experience something, but we haven't yet labeled it. The mind hasn't yet identified it. It's there, we're experiencing it, it is. And it's only afterwards we say, oh, that's this, or that's that, or that's the other thing. And the intellect starts to divide things and separate them and take them apart. It's a car, it's not a truck. It's a dog, it's not a cat. It's, the intellect is kind of putting things into little boxes and excluding all others. But before that moment when consciousness starts to exercise its dominion to name things, as we're told in the Old Testament, it just is. It just is. And this is what the Buddhists would tell us is the suchness of life. This is what in the Old Testament, in the Torah, I believe is meant by the I am. The I am. We can say that God exists. It is. I am. But if we say anything else about it, the intellect is now dividing it, categorizing it, separating it. And God is one and indivisible and cannot be divided, cannot be categorized, cannot be separated. The intellect cannot grasp it. So the Upanishads tell us that which is before words or beyond words, but from which words come. That which is beyond thoughts, but from which thoughts come. And we could say that which is beyond matter, but from which matter comes. So when we get to the third level, when we get to the interpretations at the third level, we are talking experience. And we are frequently talking experience that defies intellectual understanding. We can't describe in words. We can't express in words what it is that we are experiencing. It is beyond our ability. It is ineffable, is the way I believe Richard Maurice Buck describes the mystical experience, the cosmic consciousness, the ineffable experience. It just is. We just are. So if we think about this time of the year, we can think about it also in these three levels, right? There is the physical or the material of what people do, what people have done for thousands of years, what they have done at this time. We can take it a little bit further and we can say, is there a meaning that we can ascribe, that we can put all these things together? Are they trying to tell us something common? Remember, I mentioned Joseph Campbell in his works on mythology. He looked at the mythology, and I just need to explain mythology, because in our culture, the word myth is commonly interpreted to mean something that's false, a lie. That's just a myth. Don't believe that. There's no truth in it. But the other meaning of myth, and the one that we're using today, is a myth is a parable, a teaching story. Campbell would say it's a metaphor. It is a metaphor. And what it is it is a story that holds a deep value for a culture. Now, for the people who believe the myth to be true, an actual fact, as opposed to a teaching story, that myth represents their religion. And it's easy for human beings to look at the mythology of another religion and say, well, that's not literally true. See, that's just a myth. But when it comes to our own religion, we say, but my mythology is true. I don't even recognize it as mythology. I recognize it as being true. So what Campbell was able to do was to step back from this judgment of what is true and what is false and say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's true or false, because the value that it holds is not in its historical accuracy, but it's in what it is conveying. It is the message that it is conveying from human consciousness, from collective consciousness. The Jungian archetypes, right? Carl Jung looked at people of many different cultures and found out that at the subconscious level in the dreams, our symbols are the same. Why are our symbols the same when we are clearly different people? We live in different times. We live in different places. We have different experiences. So in Jung's way of thinking, there's a collective unconscious, right? There's something that connects all of us. Dr. Holmes would call it mind. We are all part of this one mind, and we are all connected to this one mind. And Joseph Campbell asked the question, how is it that the Iroquois Indians in North America and the South Sea Islanders in the South Pacific have mythological stories that convey the same value set, but the characters are in tune with their own culture, their own customs. So it's like they built a character and they cloaked this character in their own custom, in their own culture, someone or something that they would recognize. But the important thing is that there's a deeper truth that is being expressed. There's a deeper truth that is trying to bubble up to the surface. And the human consciousness tries to interpret it and interprets it in a way that is in agreement with their culture. We'll see this with the traditions that various cultures have engaged in at this time of the year. So we'll look at some of the different traditions. We'll kind of look at the interpretations and what they mean. But eventually we have to come to, but wait a second. Is this just a story? Is this just something that we're being told? Or is this relating to an experience of my own soul? Is this bringing me to an awareness of something that I too can experience? That I too can participate in at the spiritual level. So I want us to think as we go through this, I want us to think about, what is your Easter experience? What is the experience of Easter? As I said, I passed through the neighborhood yesterday and the kids were out with their baskets and running around, And Lori was watching a talk show on TV this week, and several people get around, some cooking show, but there's several co-hosts. And the question came up, what was Easter like for you as a child, And it was kind of interesting because the people would say, well, I grew up in a very religious family. We were devout and then fill in the denomination. So Easter was a big holiday for us. And then they would immediately go into talking about hunting for Easter eggs or chocolate bunnies or things like that. See? So the experience that they had of hunting for Easter eggs or eating chocolate bunnies was not a spiritual experience. Now, I realize it was a talk show about cooking, and they couldn't talk about their profound religious experiences if they had them as children. But it was interesting because I think if we go back and ask people what their Easter experience is, they will go back to some childhood memory, sitting around the table, waiting for Mom to carve the ham. I remember as a child, my grandmother used to come before Easter and get my brother and I and put us on the bus and take us over a few miles down the road to where they had the bigger stores. And she would buy our Easter clothes for us. We would get new clothes, almost every Easter, doing our Easter shopping. So for me, the Easter experience has to do with getting new clothes. For other people, it has to do with candy and eggs and things like that. But none of those are spiritual experiences. those are experiences at the material level of life. So let's take a quick look then at this time of the year. And this time of the year is all about renewal. Renewal. We see life coming back. We see things that were almost dead or appeared to be dead coming back to life. You know, I'm looking out the window at a tree that maybe 10 days ago there wasn't a leaf on it. You could see right through to the sky behind it. Now you can only see patches of the sky here and there. The leaves are just coming out. You can see life coming back from its winter rest. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. The spring in each hemisphere are just 6 months apart. And the idea of this renewal, whether you're in the southern hemisphere or the northern hemisphere, the idea of renewal is there. It is something deep within the human psyche that the human psyche recognizes and represents. So one meaning of renewal is this coming back, this coming back. There's this immovable force of life itself that is coming back. It will not be denied. It will express itself. It will find an outlet. It will push up through the cracks in the driveway, and it will come into bloom. And another meaning of renewal at the human level, we sometimes use renewal as in a sense of a recommitment. You know, like we purchase a subscription to a magazine, a one-year subscription, and the end of the year comes up, and we have to renew our subscription. We're basically committing ourselves again to another year. Maybe it's a paid channel on TV or a gym membership or something like that. But we make a commitment, and then periodically we have to go back in and we have to reevaluate that commitment. We have to ask ourselves, well, is this really worthwhile? Am I getting everything out of this I thought I was going to get out of this? Could I put this money to better use? Something else. And sometimes what happens to us is we find that the thing that we committed to, we're really not getting much value out of it. And we're not getting value out of it not necessarily because it isn't a good product or service. We're not getting value out of it because we're not participating. We're not doing what we need to do in order to participate. So we have a gym membership, but we never go to the gym. Well, the gym is there. It's open 24 hours. They have all the equipment there. They have all the locker room facilities so you can change your clothes after you work out, clean up before you go to work. But there's something that we didn't do. There's something that we didn't bring ourselves to do, which was to go and participate. Same with a magazine. A magazine comes in the mailbox and we throw it on the coffee table and pick it up every once in a while and glance at it. So we want to talk about renewal in terms of life renewing itself. We want to talk about renewal in terms of our commitment. And then we want to talk about what that has to do with our spiritual experience. So the first thing we want to recognize is when the holiday comes. It comes in the springtime, and springtime is a time of renewal. Everything is coming back to life. The birds are building their nest. The animals are starting to give birth to the next generation, to the young. And this is one of the reasons why eggs and rabbits, bunny rabbits, are symbols of Easter. And they were symbols of Easter long before Christianity, long before Judaism. These things were symbols of springtime. And springtime is generally perceived as a time of renewal, a time of hope. Life is coming back. Even if you go on Google and you type in Passover and renewal, you'll find articles and sermons talking about how Passover is a holiday of renewal. Easter in Christianity is a holiday of renewal, but Easter in many, many traditions is a holiday of renewal. So eggs were a symbol of fertility and a symbol of wealth, and painting them up and decorating them and giving them to one another as gifts, was kind of a blessing, if you will, kind of a, wishing you good luck, wishing you great prosperity, wishing you a great number of children around your table, and all these old blessings that we hear in the olden days. And the rabbits, of course, also represent new growth. The new rabbits start to appear in springtime. They're born in the springtime. and they start to populate the fields. And there's a there's a common misunderstanding about how rapidly rabbits proliferate, and people think, well, they're just overrun the area in a short time, but that typically doesn't happen. They just look that way, but they really don't. I raised rabbits years ago. We had cages with rabbits, and they're not that easy. They're not that easy to raise. But the idea of the rabbits and the idea of the eggs and coloring the eggs and having the little rabbits and having the colored eggs and giving them to one another and sharing with one another is a way of participating in renewal at the material level, at the level of what's going on. We start to come into, though, an understanding. Now we start to come into kind of an intellectual question and answer, an intellectual awareness. But isn't the egg a symbol of something deeper? I mean, eggs are good as they are, and eggs are symbols of fertility, and they grow, but isn't there something a little bit magical about an egg? And isn't there something a little bit mysterious about an egg? Because inside that egg can grow a tiny chick. A tiny little chick in there. Now, you and I didn't put it in there. Human beings did not put that egg and that chick inside that egg. But nevertheless, it is there. And as we talked about the seed last week, that chick has everything it needs in that egg. It has everything that it needs to grow and to prosper and to thrive. And it just grows from a tiny cell, and it grows into an embryo, and then it starts to get itself covered with feathers. And at a time of its choosing, there's something within that chick that moves that chick into action. There's something in there that tells it it's time. It is time to get out of this shell. And the chicks come, some of them with a little special tooth called an egg tooth. A little special tooth that is just perfect. It is just perfect for pecking a hole through the shell, for making its way out. And I think it's important to realize that this occurs because of an inner movement within the chick. Something within it tells it it's time to move. If we looked at it from the outside, if we didn't understand what was going on, we would look at it from the outside and we would say, "Oh my goodness, there's a little bird trapped inside there. We need to rescue it." And we would crack it open, and of course, we wouldn't have good results. The same with a caterpillar going into a cocoon. The same symbolism is there. The caterpillar knows when it's time to go into the cocoon, and it knows when it's time to come out as the butterfly. But if we were to go in there and cut that cocoon open ahead of time, the butterfly wouldn't live. So there's a trust, there's a hope involved. There's an inner knowing, there's an inner guidance. There is something there that knows what to do and when to do it and how to do it. So in this idea of renewal, in this idea that there is something within that knows, this deeper knowing, this deeper sensing that perhaps we have, we start to get into the theme of death and resurrection. Death and resurrection. And this also is something that has been around for a very long time. In many traditions, this idea of death and resurrection occurs. And it's easy to see at springtime. A tree that fell in the forest over the winter, it appears to be dead, but in the springtime, the roots start to put out new shoots, and they start to grow. new shoots. So even though the trunk that was there, even though the big tree that was there previously is gone, suddenly there's new growth. It's coming back to life. In some cultures, Campbell tells us, in some cultures this whole idea is tied into human sacrifice, in the cultures that practiced human sacrifice. If you take something good and you put it in the ground, you get more of it. It comes back and it multiplies itself. It multiplies itself at least 10 times over, which is, by the way, where tithing came from. 10%. The 10% of seed that you put in the ground gives you next year's crop. So you save your best 10% of your seed. That was where the whole kind of the symbolism of the whole idea. So the idea that some societies had was, if we take someone who is good and someone who is virtuous and someone who is kind, and we kill them in a sacrifice, which they would go to as a willing victim because they understood the cycle of life, and then we dismember them and we place buried parts all around our village, then our village will prosper with goodness and kindness. This is how tied in people were to the cycle of life in olden times. The idea of death and resurrection appears to us in Egyptian mythology. It appears to us in Mithraism from Zoroastrianism, which, as I said a week or so ago, which is where we get the idea of evil and the devil from, Zoroastrianism. But this idea that life itself is immutable. Life itself is unstoppable. Life changes forms from time to time. But life itself continues to push on no matter what happens, no matter what obstacles you try to put in its way. Life continues to push on. As we have a lot of discussion now in the media about climate change, and the scientists are looking backwards. They're talking about previous episodes where things have shifted dramatically. Great die-offs, great extinctions, where something in the environment changed tremendously, and most of life as we knew it was extinguished. Most of the life forms as we knew it was extinguished, and yet something within life itself found new and different ways to express itself. We can go to the depths of the ocean, to the deepest part of the ocean, where it's down so far that there's no oxygen in the water, and yet we find life forms there that have learned to live off of the sulfur that comes out of the volcanic vents. There is something in life that pushes on. So when something appears to die in nature, it comes back to life. And this idea has then come into our intellect when we start to think about it in terms of our own mortality and our own immortality and our own soul. That very life force that animates the humans, we did not create, and the flesh did not create it. But there is something that is moving through the flesh. There is something that is moving through the physical body that pushes on. So in the first sense of looking at things at the natural world, we can see that the renewal and the death and the resurrection is a natural, normal cycle of life, a natural, normal part of life. We start to come into it in the intellectual level, and we start to see, well, this is an idea. This is an idea that has more meaning than just a tree falling in the forest and growing again. It is an idea that is welling up through consciousness, welling up through human consciousness, through collective consciousness, and it is welling up through many cultures. And the idea is that life, our life as we know it, is something that is before and beyond the physical body. That even though the physical body may die, that life is born again. Life is resurrected in a new form, in a different form, in perhaps a better form. So there's this value in the metaphor, there's this value in the mythologies of the different religions that is telling us that which we call life is before words. That which we call life is before form. That which we call life is before mind. That which we call life is the suchness, is the isness, is the I amness. As Joel Goldsmith might say, it is the true I, capital I, of who I am. And we are confused. See, we're confused most of our lives. And we think the I that I am is my body. We think the I that I am are the thoughts that I become aware of. And we start to realize that what the cultures and what the mythologies of the cultures and what the themes of death and resurrection are telling us is that the I that I am is more than the body. It is more than the thoughts. It is more than whatever human consciousness is. It exists before, it exists after this thing we call the human, the mortal life. And these themes, of course, come together in the Christian narratives of Easter. And we have to recognize that human beings are wrestling with these ideas to this day. They're wrestling with these ideas at the physical level. Did this really happen? Is this true? Did this really happen? And they're wrestling with it at the intellectual level. Isn't it similar to these other traditions and these other cultures? If you're interested in those discussions, if that's something that you want to explore more of, I'll recommend two books to you. One is The First Coming by Thomas Sheehan, S-H-E-E-A-N. And his book is about, the best I can describe it, it is about the awakening of the first century Christians, the followers of Jesus. It is about the awakening of their consciousness and their soul to the realization of who and what Jesus was. And to him, the resurrection was not necessarily a physical event, but it was a psychological event, an awakening. You might also, there's a third book, From Jesus to Christ by Paula Fredrickson. She talks about kind of the evolution of the awareness that people had as this, you know, as we're told in the New Testament. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Didn't we see him playing with his cousins when he was a little kid, playing ball in the streets? You know, isn't he just like any other kid? Who is he now? And there was this evolution from that familiarity with the human Jesus to the spiritual Christ, the mystical Christ. And then the third book is more of I guess kind of puts Jesus in the context of the time and place. It's called Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography, and the author is John Dominic Crossman. And it's a very interesting book. It's not an easy read, but it's a very interesting book. And the reason I mention it is when Crossman kind of goes into these details, you know, did this crucifixion occur? Did this resurrection occur? He talks about the Roman traditions, you know, what the Romans did, and crucifixion was a brutal act. It was an act of intimidation. It was an act of terrorism. And the Romans did this to intimidate people. You know, if you don't toe the line, well, this is what's going to happen to you. And first century Palestine was a chaotic place, and the Romans were trying to maintain their order with the, you know, brutal control. And typically what they did was if they crucified someone, they didn't take the bodies down. They left the bodies hang there as a warning to everybody else. So Crosman says, first thing we have to consider is, burial would be an unusual event. Not that it's never happened. They have found skeletal remains of human bones that have nails in them from having been crucified. So somehow the remains were preserved. But Dominic kind of puts things into that context. And my only point here is that people are arguing about, did this ever really happen? Is it an historical fact or is it not an historical fact? In Sheehan's book, he talks about the resurrection narratives, and they found scrolls of the early Gospels that didn't have resurrection narratives in them. So Sheehan asks, well, does that mean that the resurrection narratives were something that were added later? Other people will say, well, no, they just happened to leave them off of that particular scroll. It's probably on the missing page, and all this kind of discussion that there's never going to be an answer to. And to my point is that is kind of arguing things at the material level. Is this historically accurate or is this historically true? And while that may be interesting to people and it may be worthwhile to people, how does it help us get to the metaphysical level? How does it help us to get to the experience of Easter? And the same way when we go into the intellectual or the mental level, people will say, well, isn't the person Jesus in this mythology, isn't he really the same person that we see in Egyptian mythology or the same person that we see in Zoroastrian mythology and in other mythologies? Isn't this all the same kind of, like Joseph Campbell might say, the hero with 1,000 faces? Isn't this the same story that's being told, the same metaphor that's being given to us in different costumes of different cultures in different times and in different places? And I, perhaps that is so. But if so, then what is the spiritual experience that these metaphors are pointing us toward? Because ultimately, I think what we have to recognize is that what all of this is about is the growth of our soul. It is our spiritual awakening. We have to start to consider, what does this mean to me in terms of the experience that it is pointing me toward? You may recall back at Christmas we talked about the experience of the birth of the Christ within our own soul. That is the very beginnings, the very awakenings to our own spiritual nature. The Christ represents the point where the human and the divine are one. The point where the divine becomes individualized as the soul. We didn't create these lives. The life that we are is part of something that is pushing through us. So Christmas might be the beginning of the awareness within the human experience that the spiritual even exists, that the spiritual is here with us and is now, and it is growing. And when we come to the Easter narratives, to me it represents that time in our growth, that place in our growth, that place in our experience where we are totally committed to the spiritual, where we are ready to throw off the physical. Now, typically people think of that as meaning death, and it could be. It could very well be that. But it could also be that we no longer identify with the material. We don't think of ourselves as the body. We don't think of ourselves as our name. We don't think of ourselves as that person we see in the mirror, but we think of ourselves in a new and different way. We identify with the soul. We identify with the spirit. We identify with the individualized expression of the divine. And we are willing to have all of our old material ways or old material things. We are willing to have all of that taken away, broken, destroyed, crucified. Take our old human ideas and be done with them so that we can have the experience of being born again, literally being born again into the life, the spiritual life, into the experience of the soul. It's very interesting if you go back and you look at the kind of the evolution of the Eastern narratives. If you put the Gospels into a timeline of when they were written, you can actually see how the story has things kind of added to it. And one of those is the presence of the stone. The presence of the stone. Now you would have to think that any power that could bring the dead back to life would certainly not have trouble with a stone, not have trouble rolling the stone away. And yet there's significant events around the earth quaking and the angels rolling back the stone and things like this. And remember, angels represent divine ideas. And one of the interpretations of that story that is very meaningful to me that I will share is if you take it back to the chick pecking its way out of the shell. The stone represents the obstacles in our own consciousness that we have that are preventing us from experiencing our true nature. They are the limiting ideas and beliefs, kind of like the cap of mud that goes over the top of us. And at some point, like that chick in the egg, at some point there is a stirring within our soul. There's a stirring that we didn't put there. But there is something within us that is calling us to itself. And here's where we differ from nature. Here's where we differ from the chick. The chick has no choice. When nature tells it to poke a hole in the shell, it pokes a hole in the shell. Whether it's time, whether it's temperature, whether it's heat, whether it's moisture, whether it's food supply, whatever. There's something within that chick that knows when it is time to come out. And we have to remember that at that point, the eggshell is stifling further growth of the chick. That which protected it, that which was necessary for its growth up until that point, is of no value any longer. If the chick is to live the fullness of its life that it was created to live, it has to punch a hole in that shell. But it has no choice. It is compelled to do so by a power within that it is probably not even aware of. But you and I, we are aware, and you and I have been created with free will, and you and I must cooperate. Spirit can stir within us the awareness that it's time. It is time for us to break out of our shell. It is time for us to break loose of the old limiting ideas that have been keeping us back and holding us from the full experience of our spiritual nature. But we have to agree. We have to consciously choose. We can say, not yet, not yet. Like the prayer of Augustine, oh God, make me good, but not yet, not yet. So we can become aware. We can feel the stirring. But if we are truly to roll back the stone that's holding us back, to poke the hole in the shell that's keeping us from the full experience of life, we must consciously cooperate. And we do that through our spiritual practice. We do that through our prayer. We do that through our meditation. We do that for our treatment, which brings us into conscious contact with the power of the soul. We do that through our gratitude, where we bless everything we see, everyone we meet, everything that comes into our hands. We bless it all by recognizing that it is the presence and the activity of God. Every piece of food that goes into our mouth, every drink of water, every person who comes into our life is the goodness of God. In other words, we consciously choose to turn our mind away from the material, not as if it was evil. We turn away from it in thinking that it has power of its own. And we turn and we recognize the only power in the universe that there is. The power of God. Now, life goes in seasons and life goes in cycles. And we have the spring which follows the winter, and the summer will be here before you know it, and we'll be wanting that cold weather to come back. I guarantee you, when we're out there pushing that mower around in July, we will be saying, "Oh, fall, where are you?" The earth revolves around the sun once every 364 and a quarter days. But the earth is never in the same position twice, because the sun is also moving in the galaxy, and the galaxy is also moving in the universe. So while it looks like we've been here before, this looks like the same spring we had last year, it's not. Everything is in a different place. So what we're invited to do at this time of the year is to recognize ourselves as spirit, as soul, and to renew our commitment to our spiritual growth, to renew our subscription to our spiritual growth, and to look back and say, did I grow as much as I wanted to in this last 12 months? And if not, is it because the gym was closed? Or is it because I didn't participate as fully as I could have participated? I think we have to recognize that we have available to us through consciousness, we have available to us everything that we need. Just like the chick in the eggshell has available to it everything it needs. If you or I were cast alone on a deserted island in the middle of nowhere and spent the rest of our life in solitary, we could find the presence of God within, because everything that we need is already here. In the New Testament, Jesus tells us to go within, which means look in your consciousness. And in order to go within, we have to temporarily shut out the outside world. Turn off the distractions, turn off the cell phones, all those kind of things, and sit and be still. Sit and be still and know. So what we're invited to do now, this Easter, is once again renew our commitment to our spiritual growth. As we see the immutable force in nature pushing itself through everything, we recognize that immutable force is pushing itself through us, and it is pushing itself through us for the purpose of our own awakening to the presence of God within and to our relationship with that presence. We have another 365 and a quarter days before next Easter. We have an opportunity to consciously cooperate in the growth and the renewal of our soul. We can look at how magnificent life is at pushing itself through every expression of life that cooperates with it by simply doing what it was created to do, putting its roots into the soil, absorbing the minerals, absorbing the moisture, and growing. The mighty oak tree starts as a tiny acorn. And how much more so will that life push itself through you and I, because we can consciously choose to cooperate. So I invite you then this year, as you go around and you watch the children collecting their eggs, smile. Smile at their fun. Smile at their youth. Smile at your memories. But recognize that this is a symbol of something deeper within you. It is the experience of the presence of your soul the experience of the presence of God within, that these things are pointing you to, that these things are inviting you to. It is not an intellectual knowing, it is not a physical doing, but it is a spiritual experience of the death to the human and the resurrection as the spiritual beings that we truly are. I invite you to make this year a year of renewal, a year of growth, and so it is.